Yes.
Let's shut everybody up.
Wahaha. Well, if you haven't had the chance yet, you can find a lot of these recordings on YouTube. Always my best intention is to record every one just so that people can see it later, right? Because sometimes they actually have useful stuff in them. But I also don't edit, so they do have this bit of banter that we do at the beginning and at the end. I think that's kind of fun. It adds color to the occasion. What's the weather outside like today, folks? Anybody?
Like 112 degrees.
At least.
64% humidity.
Yeah.
Humid.
Very humid.
Good old humidity. Gotta love it.
Yeah.
1 o'clock.
Well, there we are. We're right on the hour. My name is Adam Fletcher, Sasse. And today we're doing a presentation on riding into the past of Fort Omaha. Today I'm joining you from a hamlet called Caroline in the province of Alberta, Canada. This is the High Prairie, a little bit different from our prairie in Omaha. The High Prairie, this is where the bison were last. Canada's a different place. I've been here now for 2 months, and it's a learning opportunity for me. But definitely a lot underway and a lot going. My love for North Omaha increases even with time and distance, and I continue my journey of exploration, and I'm excited to join you all here today for this conversation. Believe it or not, since 2008, when I started my North Omaha history project, I have presented on the history of Fort Omaha no fewer than 15 times. So a little bit more than 1.5 times per year, or a little bit more than once every 2 years. And it's been interesting because I try to evolve the presentations. I never do the same one twice. That bores me as a presenter, as a history nerd. But it also, I liked the idea of people getting interested in what I'm interested in the moment. And Fort Omaha is one of those things. It's like an onion. And the more you peel the layers, the stinkier it gets. Maybe it makes you cry a little bit, but it gets more and more flavorful, and it gets more and more interesting. The middle of that onion is so interesting to me. And I'm still working on getting there with Fort Omaha. So today you're going to hear about where I'm at with it now. But I'm also going to share with you a special present at the end of the presentation. So stay tuned. And here's a hint. If you have a cell phone, have it ready. For the end, in an hour. This is going to go by fast. I always say the same thing. I have way too much information packed into way too short of a time, but we're going to make the most of it. If you have questions, comments, considerations, ideas, thoughts, throw them in as we go along, and let's just see how that goes. I do not mind being derailed in the middle of this thing. We can go down any rabbit hole you want. If you are online, if you're Max or Ajamal, I invite you to post questions via the chat feature or to just unmute yourselves and speak right up. And let's dive in. Today's presentation on riding into the past of Fort Omaha is going to be chronological. I'm interested in these chronological histories lately, A to Z, or as they say in Canada, A to Z, because that's interesting. But for you folks playing along at the church there, and you can see this opening screen, Max, maybe you can see it too. There are several images here, and I asked you all to see if you could identify any of them. Does anybody want to tell me anything that they can observe? Did I stump all of you to begin with?
I believe it's the Bloom School on the left, right?
It's not, although it's the right era. You're right in the right era. Dun, dun, dun. So I got to tell you, 2 of these pictures, yeah, I think just 2, have a really neat story for me. About 8 years ago, so picture that, way back in 2017, I was contacted by an old guy from New Jersey. This guy was in his late 90s, and he said he had spent 20 years trying to find somebody in Omaha who cares about the history to give his father's photo album of unique, one-of-a-kind pictures from World War I when he was stationed at Fort Omaha. He wanted to give this album to an institution. He called the Historical Society multiple times. They didn't want it. He called the Durham multiple times. They didn't want it. He called the Metro. They didn't want it.
Oh,
So 8 years ago, he got in touch with Adam. And he said, I don't know who you are or what you do, but you've got the best stuff out there about Fort Omaha. Do you want it? I said, I drooled. I was like, but I'm not an archive. I'm not going to, pretend like it's going to be the center of everything that I do, but I'd love to have it. He's like, let me gift it to you. So this guy in his 90s sent me his dad's photo album from World War I at Fort Omaha, filled with photos. It also has the rest of his service in there, and it's fascinating. He's got pictures from France. But here was the interesting part. They're done in these photos that are actually like 1 by 1. They're really tiny pictures. And I was really intrigued by it. But one of them is right here on the left. I haven't studied the photo album yet. I haven't looked up his father's story, anything like that, because I'm just enamored by this stuff. But eventually I'll get there, I'll promise. But I'm sharing the pictures here for the first time ever in any presentation. So, and there's a couple that are spread throughout the slides that we'll dig into as we go along. On the left, somebody said is at the balloon school. You can see at the bottom, it says Loon Co. What it said at one point was Balloon Company, and it actually still says that in the photo album. But here in this photo, what I've done was blown it up and clipped it out just so it'll fit in that spot. This is a company of men who are marching out of the gate at the east side of the campus going on to 30th Street. And you could see them turning south onto 30th. That's the guardhouse that you can just see the corner of on the left. Do you see the parade ground in the background with the flagpole shooting up? So just to help orient you. This is they're turning from a road on campus that goes out. I think we call it the Shrive Gate now. We'll get there. But the point is they're going out onto 30th Street and turning south. They're marching. And you could see their doughboy hats and the whole thing from World War I. We're going to get into that history. In the middle, you can see it says Reserve Corps. And what the entire caption says is Officers Reserve Corps Barracks. And you can see 2 wood frame buildings that are going up a hillside. That hillside is on the west side of the fort, north of Sorensen Parkway today. But you could see they were wooden barracks. And back there where the mule barn is, you might be familiar with other stuff, that used to be filled with these wooden barracks buildings. And there were dozens of them. And I have photos of many of them from World War I and before. The barracks were actually built in the 1880s, these wooden barracks to help expand the fort. We'll get into that. Nobody recognizes the color photo here? Here's a hint. Oh, go ahead.
The Crook House.
Right. So this is the General Crook House, the home of the Douglas County Historical Society. And you could see it in its original form and what it looked like. This is in 1978. The society, and we'll talk about this later, but the society took it over in 74. So they had it for a few years at this point and had restored it, begun the restoration. And then there are 3 pictures crammed above, and we're going to see those as we go along. So let's jam right into this thing. Again, questions, comments, concerns, considerations, ideas, anything at all, let me know as we go along. Today, I want to share this story in a chronological fashion, like I'd said, but I also want to throw in some randoms just because I think it's fun. You might remember our presentation from last quarter, which is exclusively on the Fort Omaha Balloon School. And you could see a photo of a balloon. Now, wait a second, Adam. That looks like a hot air balloon, but I thought they did other things there. Well, ladies and gentlemen, they surely did. Because remember that Fort Omaha, actually, it was always called the Balloon School, but it began in 1904 as a dirigible school. And we're going to see a photo of one of those in a moment. But they switched from helium-filled dirigibles to hot air balloons. And that's what we're seeing right here was when they transitioned. But you could see they literally looked like a balloon. All of that webbing going up on the sides in the kind of conical way, that's all rigging. And the men learned how to weave that and make it work and everything. In the upper right-hand photo, you can see a picture of a hospital. This hospital used to sit on Officers Row at the north end of the row. There is no building there today, but it was a hospital building. And then below that, you can see another photo from the photo album that I mentioned. And this is later on, this was used as a hospital. It was also used as a barracks, but we're actually going to feature this building in just a minute as we keep going. A few quick facts about Fort Omaha. It was established in 1868. The Omaha Barracks began in downtown Omaha, what we think of today as the Gallup campus, between there and Slowdown and that kind of where the stadium is in that little region. There was actually a berm of land that was established in the 1860s that cut off what we think of as Gallup today, and cut that off from the rest of the downtown region because of the floodwaters. They were wrestling with that as early as the city began in 1854. But the Omaha Barracks built up down there, and then they had to move it because apparently the floodplain was a problem. And eventually they moved up to 30th and Fort. Now, how did they get there? I'm going to tell you that in just a second. Metro Community College opened up there on the Fort Omaha campus in 1976. And I would make an argument that the story of Fort Omaha's preservation as a historic space with 30 historic structures, 20 historic markers, and I'm going to tell you now, hundreds of historic stories. Some that are awesome, some that are interesting, and others that are bad, just downright bad. We're going to touch base on many of those stories, not all of them. We don't have time for hundreds, but a couple here and there. And again, that secret gift that I'm going to tell you about at the end, that has deets, the real stories. Anyhow, 1868, by then there was a Kuntz, Augustus Kuntz was one of the early bankers in Omaha, but he was also a land speculator, and he had land all over the city, north of the city, south of the city, east of the city. If you're familiar with, I don't know, First National Bank, yeah, that's the bank that the Kuntz brothers started. If you're familiar with the old Forest Hill, oh, wait a second, you might be familiar with, I don't know, Grace Bible College used to be there, Grace University. Oh, and before that, St. Catherine's Hospital. Anybody familiar with St. Catherine's Hospital? It used to be located down at 11th and Forest Avenue, right off of Pierce, right by Pierce. So you can picture that, like kind of the Little Italy neighborhood we think of it now as now. But back then it was called Forest Hill because there was a mansion on top of the hill, and that mansion belonged to Augustus Kuntz. Now, if you're a North Omaha lover, you might be familiar with the Kuntz name because of the park that bears Augustus and his brother's name, or the house over on Wirt Street that belonged to one of the Kuntzes. But the point in this story is that Augustus Kuntz owned the land that became Fort Omaha, and he made the U.S. government a deal. Now, the history books are going to tell you he gifted the land. He didn't gift the land. He made money off of it. He was a land speculator, and he made money. There's a reason why the wealthy became wealthy, because they were out to make money. Kind of like right now. Anyway, the point is, Metro opened there in 76, greatest preservation story in Omaha's history, it could be argued. They managed to save this entire district, which did become listed on the National Register of Historic Places as the Fort Omaha Historic District. They preserved these 30 historic structures, 20 historic markers, hundreds of historic stories. They couldn't do the same thing for Jobbers Canyon. They did do the same thing for Minnelusa, but, you know, a little smaller houses and kind of younger history. But anyway, the point is, it's a good thing. So here's the first era that I want to talk about. And we're going to call it the Pioneer Era. Now, I just made these up. And let me give a few a few qualifications really quick before I continue. Thing number one, ladies and gentlemen, I am not a trained and academic historian. I'm a guy who loves North Omaha. First, I love history of North Omaha. Second, I love the people in North Omaha. Not every single one of them. I don't have that big of a heart. I try, especially since most of you just came from church. I really try, I promise. But I've got my limits. And the point being that I make stuff up. Now, I don't make up the facts. I don't make up the details. All of that is based in really rigorous research that's actually a pain in my neck a lot of the time. But I love doing it. I love digging and digging and digging. And I go through everything. I go through newspapers and historic archives. I get into the history books that other people have written. I read the academic articles. I read everything that I can get. And I put all this together in context. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm just figuring it out as I go along. I also love the old pictures, and that's what you're going to see a lot of right here. This picture in front of you, I'm going to nominate as one of the hardest to find pictures of Fort Omaha ever made. If only because if you look really closely at it, you'll notice that it's not a photo. This is actually a drawing that was done right around 1875. And in this drawing, you will not see one brick building. That's right. Instead, what you see here, every single building that's shown is made of wood. Because when Fort Omaha was first built in 1868, all the way into the 1870s, it was originally wood structures. Now I'm going to tell you something equally as fascinating. One of them still stands today. Not on the campus, not on Fort Omaha, but we'll get there later. The pioneer era lasted from about 1868 when the fort was started to 1881 when the frontier was closed. Now you can color in all the blank lines that you want. The cavalry, the U.S. Army cavalry, they came here. This was after the Civil War. The first African-American soldiers, Buffalo soldiers, came to Fort Omaha in the 1870s. They were coming through on their way west. They were never stationed. There were not Buffalo soldiers, African-American soldiers stationed at Fort Omaha until the 1910s. We'll get there in a minute. But during this pioneer era, we did have a lot of cavalry on horseback. We had a lot of wagons. We had a quartermaster function going on at Fort Omaha because you might be familiar with the quartermaster depot that's in South Omaha. That wasn't built yet. Fort Omaha was the predecessor to it. You could see the parade ground in this picture. It's approximately in the same place still to this day. But you can also see a lot of things have changed. We're going to get into those nitty-gritties in a minute. But this is one of my favorite images. Now, in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see a graphic that I made. If you ever see this graphic anywhere, you know that Adam made that. Fort Omaha, USA, by golly, woo-wee, with a balloon in the middle. Because that seems to be the most, I don't know, historic legacy. But I made that graphic 15 years ago, and I bump into it every now and then on other people's stuff. I like that. It's kind of fun. Anyway, this pioneer era had a lot of remarkable things that happened during it. 1862, before the fort existed, Omaha was designated the headquarters of the military district of the Nebraska Territory. Remember that Nebraska Territory didn't cease to exist until 1869 when Nebraska became a state. So the Nebraska Territory had its own headquarters for the military, and that was in Omaha. Now, if you're following along in the larger historical schema and everything that was going on at that point, you know that the United States was waging a genocide against Native Americans. It was a very active battle that they had on a lot of fronts, and really heinous things happened. Natives did things that were bad. U.S. Army soldiers did things that were worse. It was a stinky bad time. But all of those forts that the U.S. was using to colonize and take over the West, they all needed supplies. They all needed backup. They all needed support. And that's what Fort Omaha provided to them. Never was Fort Omaha built to defend Omaha. That's mythology. But it has had defense roles. And I'm going to tell you, I think I might be the only person to say this. And for those of you following along in the Adam journey, you know that this isn't the only thing that people dispute. Fort Omaha defended Omaha against Omahans more than it defended Omaha against any Native American ever. I'll tell you the details of all that later. But the point is, 1862, Omaha was designated the headquarters. In 1866, Omaha was made the headquarters of the U.S. Army Department of the Platte. Now, the Department of the Platte wasn't just the Nebraska Territory, even though that was huge in 1862, but the Department of the Platte was even bigger. And Omaha became that headquarters. The Sherman Barracks were established at 30th and Fort in 1868. That was their original name. They were named for William Tecumseh Sherman, who was a Civil War general on the Union side. And he didn't like it. He was still alive. He was like, no, don't name those after me. He was one of those crotchety old guys who wore a stogie in his mouth. And, you know, he had the hat that was kind of curled up on the side and just looked like a tough old bird in his pictures. So he said, don't call that. Call it that. And so it was renamed the Omaha Barracks. And then in 1878, the Omaha Barracks became Fort Omaha. This other thing began in 1878 and 1879, where they began building rebuilding the wooden buildings, the original wooden buildings that I showed you the drawing of. They began replacing them with brick buildings. Dun, dun, dun. And so it began. However, in 1879, a notoriously nefarious trial happened at the fort, where a military court found that Standing Bear and his tribe of Poncas See, the Poncas were kicked out of Nebraska. They were sent on a trail of tears, not the Trail of Tears. It's famous in all the history books, but a trail of tears from their northern Nebraska homelands down to Oklahoma. And Standing Bear and his group, they had several bands inside of the Ponca at that point. Standing Bear and his people decided, hey, we don't want to live here. This is scrubland. We're going back home. So they headed back to Nebraska from Oklahoma. And when they got to Nebraska, the U.S. Army stopped them and said, Standing Bear, you're under arrest. And they brought Standing Bear to Fort Omaha and they threw him in the Huskow. And they held patrol over him. In reality, Standing Bear was given a lot of latitude. His people camped outside the fort. And the point is that there was a trial. And this military judges, they heard testimony from General Crook himself, who said, this is a ridiculous thing. The United States is completely in the wrong. And we're not recognizing that these people, these natives, are actual human beings. And the fact of the matter is, until the Standing Bear trial, there was no record of the United States government in any way, shape, or form ever acknowledging natives as human beings. But at the trial of Standing Bear, for the first time ever, this military tribunal of judges appointed by the United States said Indians are humans for the first time ever. Imagine that, dehumanizing. I mean, literally taking away somebody's humanity for generations to make it okay to do what they did. But the point is, Standing Bear won his suit, won the right to go back to his land, and his people lived there for the rest of their days. Today, there's a Ponca tribe of Oklahoma, a Ponca tribe of Nebraska. It's been a long battle, a long effort to get that recognized, but it's underway. In 1881, the original Department of the Platte headquarters building became the post hospital. So that Department of the Platte headquarters building we're going to see in just a moment because I'm a little bit fixated on it. But before then, I want to put some context to this. First thing, on the left-hand side, you're going to see two buildings. Now, these two buildings were part of a larger photo that showed several officers' quarters at Fort Omaha. They're made of wood. You see those two little dormers. You see the triangular shape on the side of the roof line. I'm going to show you the same building again more than 170 years later in just a little while. Stay tuned. But on the right, you're going to see, now wait a second, Adam, what's this jazz? I don't see Fort Omaha in here. No, you don't. However, at the bottom of the map, you'll see where it says Omaha. Fort Omaha was located right about the letter H on that map of Omaha. But the reason why I wanted to show you this is that this puts why Fort Omaha was put there into context, because all of these institutions that are shown on this map existed before Fort Omaha opened in 1868. The steamboat Bertrand ran aground up there in the north. DeSoto was right there. Cruzat's Post was probably somewhere right along there. Cantonment, Missouri, where the U.S. Army set up their first post off the river. Fort Calhoun, Fort Atkinson. The Engineer Cantonment further south. Cantonment Barber further south. Lisa's Post. Wait a second, Adam. That's right by Fort Dodge Park. Present-day Dodge Park right now. Rockport. South of that, Cabinier's Post, which was right next to Dodge Park on Pershing Drive, or the old River Road, whatever you want to call it. All of this history is part of North Omaha's Wild West history and situates Fort Omaha approximately with all that stuff. And that's all before the city of Omaha existed, folks. Oh, did I mention North Omaha's got the oldest history in the entire city? That's another story for another day. However, these two photos are going to show us what's been referred to as the U.S. Army Department of the Platte, as the U.S. Army Fort Omaha Hospital. And today, this building still stands and you can go see it. And I'm going to show you a photo of it at the end of this. But look at those handsome troops all lined up in formation in front of the building. Now look at the wooden frontage on this because it was cold and drafty getting into the building in wintertime. Now here's a cool one. The Victorian era. Now, the Victorian era, you all are familiar with the Victorian era homes around Omaha. You know, those Queen Anne style beautifuls, or the Scottish baronial Joslin Castle. Oh, the Queen Anne style you might be thinking of, I don't know, let's think of whose favorite, anybody have a favorite Queen Anne style house in Omaha? I hear you thinking it. Somebody said the Zabriskie house in their own mind. Yeah, over there in Bemis Park. That's a beauty. That's a Queen Anne style house. If somebody is thinking about, I don't know, the Horser house on Reddick Avenue, just west of 30th Street, what are you saying, Adam? There's a Victorian house right here in the neighborhood that I can go visit after the presentation. Absolutely. I heard that recently it was renovated and blah, 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 but all the same, you can go see the turret on it just west of Reddick. I'm sorry, just west of 30th on Reddick, up from the church. You can see a house with a turret on the side. That's Queen Anne style. So picture this Victorian era. People dressed fancy, and they went to military formations like this one, shown in the late 1890s. These are officers on their horses in white, and then in the distance, you can see non-commissioned officers on their horses in dark chestnut colored horses. The non-commissioned officers in the distance are holding up their sabers in greeting to their military hierarchy. What's not really shown very well is that in the distance, underneath the tree line, those are soldiers and their encampment made of those tents. And in front of the camera is a group of hoity-looking upper-class swanky people. In the late 1890s, when the fort was still open, people used to get into their buggies and their carriages and ride out to Fort Omaha from downtown Omaha, or from the North Omaha mansions and estates that they had. And they would ride out to Fort Omaha and watch the soldiers in formation. Like, it was this whole thing where they watched their drills and everything. It was a fascinating thing. And that's what the folks in front of the camera are doing, or behind the camera that you can't really see. But this is the Victorian era. It's kind of high style. And like, they wore their big hoop dresses and their finery and their buttoned up shirts with their fancy ties and this whole thing. So you can really get this sense that it was an event. Now, the Victorian era is a little bit slim on details. 1896, Fort Omaha. Oh, wait a second, Adam. This doesn't sound good. It's because it wasn't. In 1896, for the very first time ever, Fort Omaha was declared a surplus property by the U.S. Army, and they officially abandoned it. They left a couple of troops there to keep clean, sweep the houses every now and then, but they were out. They were gone. In 1898, though, the Spanish-American War began overseas and in Mexico, and Fort Omaha had a little tiny role in that, in storage and preparation for the war. There was a railroad that ran up present-day Sorensen Parkway, and that railroad served Fort Omaha. There was a depot that was located right next to Fort Omaha, and that served the Army. So the fort had a little bit of relevance during the Spanish-American War. But I call the next one the most relevant era. I mean, except for present day, when the fort is, of course, very relevant. But this is one where I have the coolest pictures. So here we go. You'll see right here at the big image. Oh, the most relevant era, I say, is from 1902 to 1918. Now, you can see the caption right there. It says, I don't know if I can read that. SODN, period. Leaving Fort Omaha. These are the troops that I showed you earlier that were turning the corner. Here they're going south.
I think it's squadron.
Thank you. Squadron, that's a Q. SQDN. So squadron leaving Fort Omaha. And they're driving south on 30th Street. How about that? I'd never seen a view of south on 30th Street. This is probably right around Ellison. Looking south on 30th. I'd never seen this view before. And honestly, I still don't have a great view of 30th and Fort. So if anybody's hiding one of those photos from 1900 or thereabouts, I'd love to see it. But you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, the Balloon School Helium House. That was put in 1904, expanded on, changed, and eventually became a whole thing by World War I in 1917. We're going to talk about that for just a second in a minute. But then right above that, you can see an old-timey Army motorcycle with a sidecar. And these were actually used and instituted around Fort Omaha routinely and habitually by the Signal Corps. The U.S. Army Signal Corps was a group of men who were charged with officially communicating on behalf of the Army, within the Army troops and among the Army troops from the distance. Now, they used telegraphs, and they were responsible for sending telegraphs all around the nation. Beep, 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 beep. But they also used and instituted for the first time on a mass scale semaphore. Anybody familiar with what semaphore is? Here's a hint. Oh, come on. Any Boy Scouts in the room? I know that back in the 80s, we learned about this in the Boy Scouts before I became an Eagle Scout at Pearl Church. We learned about it. Say it again.
Signaling with flags.
Thank you. I'm holding signaling flags. Semaphore was a code that was used with multiple colored signaling flags. And basically, we think of this right now. It's like, oh, how quaint and old timey. They figured out in the 1860s an entire language with flagging, with semaphore. And the Fort Omaha Balloon School, which was home to the U.S. Army Signal Corps, instituted semaphore in in the Spanish-American War and then in World War I. And they used these motorcycles to relay those signaling guys hill to hill, over the ranges, over the distance. So those motorcycle patrols actually played a big deal. And you can, if you look really close in that photo of 30th Street, you can see some motorcycles tromping along right there. Here's a little timeline of that era. 1907, the U.S. Army established a dirigible training program at Fort Omaha. In 1908, the U.S. Army established a balloon training program at Fort Omaha. Folks, I cull all of my information, like I said, from a lot of different sources, but all of this, I actually looked up the newspapers and found the original articles that cited all of it. There are some alternate histories that people have been writing to expand on or detract from what I have shared. They do that in all kinds of topics, but they've especially done it on Fort Omaha. Apparently, the Historical Society, the Nebraska State Historical Society, a couple different institutions have started to pay attention to the history of Fort Omaha. But I'm going to tell you that I wrote the first history of it that was comprehensive and complete in 2009, and then expanded on it, put out, oh wait, I'm going to tell you about that gift in just a little while, 2015. So all of this information was from my original research. Some of it could be wrong, I'll grant you that. But I know this timeline to be true from what I found personally. 1909, the U.S. Army established their Signal Corps School. 1913, the Army closed the Signal Corps School at Fort Omaha, moved them on. 1916, the U.S. Army Air Service, for the first time ever, the 9th Naval District Balloon and Airship Division opened at Fort Omaha. That's right, there was no Army Air Force. I'm sorry, there was no Air Force. There was no Army Air Force in World War I. Instead, the U.S. Army Air Service did the work. The United States entered World War I in 1917, and the U.S. Army leased a place called Florence Field, 119 acres of land about a mile north, extending a mile north of Fort Omaha along Martin Avenue along 30th Street. Some of you might have houses in the Florence Field development that didn't begin until the late 1920s, after Charles Martin had already built up Minnelusa. So if you're playing along and following all the things, you can see how all this weaves together. 1918, World War I ended, and we saw the end of the fort's relevance in that era. However, that doesn't stop me from sharing cool pictures. Upper left-hand corner, Officer Reserve Corps Barracks. I told you about those a minute ago. See those old Model Ts out front? Those Model Ts were probably built at 16th and Cumming in the old Ford truck factory at 16th and Cumming. That was opened in that era that kept trucking. You can see those wooden barracks. They aren't the fancy brick buildings that you're used to, but they did serve their purpose during the war. To the right, you can see that dirigible that I mentioned earlier. This was filled with helium. They were very explosive. And then below it, you get a picture of one of the community centers. There were several community centers that were located at Fort Omaha, including this one that was operated by the Knights of Columbus, which is a Catholic group. There was also a YMCA that was located at Fort Omaha during World War I. But you could see here the guys are playing some football. Also on the left, you can see guys doing something with a giant ball. It looks like another sport. But I think that's a pretty cool image. This building was located approximately in the northeast corner of the campus. I haven't seen any signs of it. I used to scour the campus for entertainment value when I was growing up at 27th and Ellison. I had a friend who lived on campus. His name was Josh Bush. I went to junior high and high school with him. And Josh, his dad was a faculty at Metro. And they lived on campus. And Josh and I roamed around campus and looked at things. And it sparked my imagination about the whole place. The other person I have to give credit to is Jeff Koenig. Jeff was my 4th grade teacher at Miller Park School and took my class over to Fort Omaha for River City Roundup in the 80s. You might remember the event that happened there a few times. We sang Bye Bye Blackbird, which I had to go back and learn all the words to again about 10 years ago. And now I hum it to myself all the time. Anyway, those are my memories. I'm sure you have your own. We're going to get there. But in my looking around the campus, and I spent a lot of time because I was a dorky kid then too. I looked for old foundations. I looked for old buildings. I looked for old stuff. And I looked probably not for this specifically, but it's one of those things that I definitely scoured for. Today, you might be familiar with what used to be the Marine Corps Reserve Training Facility right at 30th and Laurel. That's approximately where this building's at. Now, between the wars, between 1918 and 1940, which is when the U.S. entered World War II, the fort continued on. It faced some hard times in there. But here's a cool picture from the 1930s showing the back of, anybody say it out loud? The back of Officers Row. One of these is actually the Fort Crook House. And one of these doesn't exist anymore, but you get the idea. This was a cool place even then. Back up on this hillside, you're familiar with the hillside then, back above the Officers Row. I was taught when I was growing up that at one point was another row of officers' facilities that were back there. I haven't found any proof of that though, and I'm still looking. So if you know better or more, let me know. But I do know that I have found that during World War I, they built a photo processing barn back up in the corner, in the northwest corner of today's Fort Omaha campus. And I actually have a photo of that on NorthOmahaHistory.com under a history of Fort Omaha. So if you want to see that barn and what it looked like, it's a pretty cool little building. But it was located approximately where this photo was taken. Here's a little timeline for this era. 1919, Fort Omaha declared surplus property and abandoned. That's right, folks. This happened repeatedly. The U.S. Army closed those gates over and over, and there weren't actually gates at that point, but you get the idea. They moved all of their balloon operations from Fort Omaha by 1921. But in the 1930s, they activated the fort again and moved the U.S. Army 7th Corps area headquarters into Fort Omaha. They used what was the old hospital and originally the Department of the Platte, they used that as the headquarters building. And during this era, some of the greatest ghost stories of the entire facility come into mind. Maybe I'll share a few of those, but first I want to take a look at this picture from the 1920s showing the inside of the Fort Omaha ice rink. Ladies and gentlemen, Fort Omaha had a year-round refrigerated ice rink that was ostensibly used just to entertain the troops and the neighborhood around. People would come from all over North Omaha to go ice skating inside of this building. How do you like me now? I think it's pretty cool. I think that's super fun and a weird factoid that not a lot of people know. There are some interesting factoids that people know. Anybody have one about Fort Omaha off the top of their head?
I just remember some of the houses in the officers' row that the walls were built very thick to help keep them cool in the summer and warm in the winter. And I thought that was fascinating.
I think it is too. I love going into the Fort Crook House right now and feeling the coolness of the building because it's air conditioned now, but also because of the thickness of the walls. And you can look in the window sashes and see those walls are a foot thick at some places. You can also walk between the rooms and see that same width in some of the rooms. Any other factoids, thoughts, ideas, memories come to mind? How about the swimming pool? Does anybody here know about the swimming pool at Fort Omaha? Today, there's a garden located west of the library building, which I think has been repurposed. Anyway, the new library building that was built in the 1970s, early 80s. To the west of that, there's a garden that's right there. And it has a concrete pathway around the outside of it. At one point, there was a brick pergola that sat right above it. But lots of people who grew up in the Miller Park, Minnelusa, and Florence Field neighborhoods, and the Redmond neighborhood, have memories from the 1940s and 50s and 60s of going swimming in a pool right at Fort Omaha. You had to pay 25 cents or some ridiculous amount. And you can go swimming in this pool that was built in the 1920s. There was actually a little campaign by the U.S. Army in the 1920s to make Fort Omaha a little bit more hospitable. And this ice rink was part of that, and so was the pool. Now, it kept changing. The fort kept adapting. And in the suburban era, that's what I'm calling this. That's when the Miller Park, Minnelusa, Redmond neighborhoods all became very suburban. I mean, they were suburban from the 1920s, from the 1910s. And by suburban, I mean a few things. And I would be remiss not to mention that there is some ugliness during these times. I'll tell you one of the ugly things. Let's dial back here. One of the ugly things that happened before World War I was that the Miller Park neighborhood next to Fort Omaha in 1916, which is before World War I, there was a group of black soldiers who were stationed in Texas. And there was a race riot that happened at their fort there. After this riot, the soldiers were moved to Fort Omaha, restationed in Fort Omaha. And residents, hundreds of residents from the Miller Park neighborhood, according to the Omaha World Herald and the Omaha Bee, the main media sources in Omaha at the time, hundreds of residents wrote to the President of the United States, wrote to the mayor of Omaha, wrote to the governor of Nebraska to complain about black soldiers being at their fort. True story. A man named Harrison Pinkett, who was one of Omaha's greatest ever civil rights fighters, spoke up on behalf of the soldiers and defended them. And eventually these soldiers went through a legal process and moved on. Harrison Pinkett from Omaha ended up representing them in civil trial and in military trials. They faced injustice because of what happened to them. But all the same, Miller Park neighborhood played an ugly spot in that history. By this point, in the suburban era, there was another incident that happened, more than an incident, a heinous act, in 1919 with the lynching of Will Brown in downtown Omaha. You might be familiar with that story. September 29th, 1919, an African-American man who was locked up and accused of raping a white girl. He was locked up at the Douglas County courthouse. He was taken out by a mob of 20,000 white people after the police were defeated, after they stepped back, and he was lynched downtown. Today, there's a placard outside of the Douglas County courthouse acknowledging this. But what it doesn't say is that the U.S. Army was called in to defend African Americans in the near North Side neighborhood down by 24th and Cumming from the white mob that had turned to attack the neighborhood. But the U.S. Army didn't call Fort Omaha first. Fort Omaha was, let's understand this, 4 miles away from downtown Omaha. But they didn't call the Army there first. Instead, they called the Army up from St. Joe on the railroad, and it took them 4 hours to get there. They didn't call the troops from Fort Omaha first because they didn't believe that those troops would defend black people in the near North Side. They did call them from St. Joe because they thought that they would. And when the St. Joe troops came, the Fort Omaha troops came, and under the command of General Wood, who said, we'll protect black people. Now, that was the beginning of redlining in Omaha, and that's a whole different thing. But the point is, the fort had some heinous stuff happen, and those were a couple of the incidences. By 1945 and the end of World War II, Fort Omaha began transitioning to different roles. It became the Naval Reserve Training Command, headquarters for the entire United States Navy.
Okay.
And you can see here a Navy sailor at the front gate. On the right-hand side, you see an ad from the Korean War era calling young men and former Marines willing to serve their country in the interests of the, I can't move the bar in front of my screen so I can, okay. In the interests of the United Nations should immediately contact the Marine Corps recruiting office at Fort Omaha. And then they had a picture of Iwo Jima right there and the whole thing. So you could see that all that was underway. 1946, oh, wait a second. We've heard this story before. Fort Omaha was declared surplus property and abandoned by the U.S. Army. In 1947, the very next year, the U.S. Navy assumed control of Fort Omaha and designated it a reserve training center. 1947, the Navy designated Fort Omaha as a Naval and Marine Corps Reserve Center. 1951, the U.S. Navy officially designated the fort as the U.S. Naval Personnel Center. In 1974, so just 20-some years later, here we go again. Fort Omaha was declared surplus property and abandoned for the 4th time since it was built and opened in 1868.
Well,
but this thing happened. Something happened on the way to falling apart, where some intervention, intercession, and otherwise acts of God saved the place. A group of volunteers with the Douglas County Historical Society got active, got involved, and started working on saving not just the General Crook House, shown here in its full image from 1978, but also the entire fort. So 1974, Douglas County Historical Society took over the General Crook House. 1976, Metro Community College took over the entire campus. In one of the greatest acts of preservation ever. I'm sorry, 1975. Metro moved into Fort Omaha. 4 years later, the entire fort was listed on the National Register of Historic Places as a National Historic District. Metro Tech worked for 30 years to protect and preserve the campus, and then in 2006 began a massive restoration and expansion project, acknowledging the federal and local dollars put into installing the Sorensen Parkway and the Stores Expressway and the North Freeway and the whole intersection at 30th Street right there, acknowledging the ongoing redevelopment of the neighborhoods around the area. Metro invested. At a time in 2006, it wasn't happening when the city of Omaha wasn't dumping money into the neighborhoods, when investors didn't see the potential, and they still don't fully. You all know this better than me. But the fact is that Metro began putting big money into the campus in 2006. They built some new buildings. They renovated some historic buildings. They brought the mule barn back to life. Oh my gosh, let's take a look at that. Oh, wait, first. Okay. Let's get cool. Now, in 1869, there was one of those officers' houses built. Remember the wooden ones that I showed you at the very beginning? Yeah. It was moved in 1900 from Fort Omaha to 6327 Florence Boulevard. And in the 70s and 80s, a family including John Sullivan renovated and restored the old Fort Omaha house, is what I called it when I found it, when I re-identified its history. The World Herald had written about it in the 70s and 80s, but nobody had talked about it all the time when I grew up. And then when I found this house, I was walking around Florence Boulevard back in 2006 or 7, and I saw it sitting way back on this lot. And so I looked it up on all the maps, historical maps, and I began to dig into its history. And it turned out that in 1900, this house was bought by the Grenville brothers, who moved it from Fort Omaha to Florence Boulevard, where they had a nursery. And they lived in this house, and they built a barn in the back. And by 2007, it was falling apart. By 2020, there was a hole in the side of the house, and raccoons were transiting in and out of the house for their own fun and entertainment. a person was living there, but it wasn't doing well. 2 years ago, a man named Tim Reeder, who is a real estate agent in Omaha, he bought the house for a song. He bought the barn. And in the last year, he set about restoring the house. Today, he's calling it the Omaha History Farm. And I don't know what his plans are. It might be the beginning of the great gentrification of Florence Boulevard, or it might be just fixing up a cool space for the community to use for history. I'm not sure. If you know, please let me know. Tim and I have talked in the past. I shared with him the original time, the first time that he ever saw this house, I had put it in his hands. And he's moved on it. You can see the new paint job right here. You could drive by it today and go take a look. I don't think it's open publicly yet, but you can go peek in the windows, I bet. 6327 Florence Boulevard. I'd love to see more pictures. Anyway, that was at Fort Omaha and built there in 1869, folks. As an old house. 150 some years. Ooh, doggy. That's one of the oldest houses in Omaha. It was moved. It was reconfigured. It does not look the way that it looked when it was on campus, except for the pitch of the roof, the windows on the sides, the location of the door, but that dormer on the front was put in. It replaced the small dormers that were there. Wait a second, Adam, what are we looking at here? Why does this building look familiar? Well, ladies and gentlemen, this was the Department of the Platte headquarters, the old post hospital, the building from the old photos that I featured at the very beginning. Here it is. And this is part of what Metro has done, is preserve and use these buildings, put new life in them, and make sure that they live on. Now, one of the favorite things that I've ever done, you know, I mess around with all this stuff. And for those of you who have been along with us on these journeys through these presentations, you've heard some variety of different things that I've shared. But one of the things that I like to do is track the ghost stories of North Omaha. And I've got a few, but a lot of the ones that I have came from Fort Omaha. Several of them are about this particular building that was a hospital for a very, very long time. And then you heard the stories. Come on, I know a few of you did. The story about the little girl in the dark dress who stood in the corner window that we can see right there. She waved out at the soldiers as they passed by for 100 years. Yeah, apparently her dad was in the army in the 1880s and he had died. And she had come to the hospital to visit him while he was there, and he died while she was there. And then she died soon after. Diphtheria, you know, that kind of thing. Anyway, her ghost haunts the building. And then there's the ghost of a German soldier from World War II. Oh, did I mention that in World War II, there were some prisoners of war who were kept at Fort Omaha? They were Italian and they were German both. They were allowed to live in the neighborhood. They had pretty free reign. But all the same, one of them did die in custody in this building. His ghost roams the place and speaks languages to people. There are many stories like that around Fort Omaha. One of the oldest buildings on campus today is the Powder Magazine. And that Powder Magazine has its own stories of explosions that happened inside when they were storing gunpowder and whatnot. Here's the restored picture of the mule barn. Oh, that's right. They had to have this gigantic mule barn in order to facilitate all that military movement from 1879 onward. They restored it, Metro did, and now it's used for learning spaces and offices. It's a beautiful building inside and out. They really did a great thing to it. You can see that on campus right now. All right, and I'm going to wrap up here. A few minutes early, we're going to do some Q&A. But before I get there, I want to share with you a present. Ladies and gentlemen, in 2015, 10 years ago, I completed the North Omaha History Guide to Fort Omaha. A friend of mine named Michaela Armetta, if you're active online in the Omaha History Club or elsewhere, you might have seen her history work. She took photos for me, and I'm going to tell you this right now. This book, it's an ebook. It's free online. You can only get it online. You can scan that QR code. I made that just for today. I'm very proud of myself. Pick up your phone, go to your photo app, open up this QR code, and it'll take you right to it. If you want to find it when you get home, just look it up on NorthOmahaHistory.com. You go and type in North Omaha History Guide, or just type in Guide to Fort Omaha in the search bar, and you're going to find it. on NorthOmahaHistory.com for free. This booklet has almost completely different information from what I've shared with you today, except for the timeline. I correlate every one of the historic buildings that are still standing to its historic uses and its current uses. I share a map showing all of the old roads that were around the fort. And I have more stories in there than you could shake a stick at. It's super fun and it's free. And that's my gift for you for coming today. Phew. My name is Adam Fletcher Sasse, and this has been Riding into the Past of Fort Omaha. Let's open up the floor. Questions, comments, concerns, considerations, ideas, anything at all. I see a couple questions here in the chat. Yeah, Jamal asked when Fort Omaha took over, or when Metro took over Fort Omaha. And I said that was 1976. Who is the local current person from the Metro Community College or Douglas County Historical Society on staff who knows the history of the campus? Jamal asked that. I need to quit pressing buttons. Anyway, do I have a relationship with either of these entities? So the Metro, I don't know anybody in an official capacity who does any history work there. I do have a friend on staff, but he's not a history-oriented person. I would love to be connected to the college in any way, shape, or form. Douglas County Historical Society, I have a bit of a tricky relationship with. I have admired the Historical Society for what they've done in the past. If any of you who are with us today are affiliated in any way, good for you. Keep going. I applied to be their executive director a couple of years ago, and they dismissed me out of hand. If only because, well, wait, they never told me why. Long story short is I tell the whole history of Omaha, and it didn't really fit into their narrative. That's a polite thing that I was told. I think that my emphasis on North Omaha is kind of off-putting for a lot of people who are interested in Douglas County's history. I do know the entire city's history. As some of you know, I've written more than 500 articles. I've started more than 500 articles on Wikipedia related to Omaha, to Omaha's history. If you look up cuisine of Omaha on Wikipedia, you'll find an article that I started there about the cuisine of Omaha and the neighborhoods of Omaha and the whole thing. But it wasn't enough for the Historical Society, and my experience and interest as a nonprofit executive in other ways just didn't match whatever their vision is. And I still don't know what it is. And it isn't obvious what it is because they're not doing a lot. For those of you following along at home on the adventure, you know that I've been doing this for all of these years as a passion project. This is just what interests me. If you want to make a donation to help support NorthOmahaHistory.com, that opportunity is on my website. But the long story short is, I don't know anybody at the Historical Society today. I would love to. I'd love to have a better relationship with them. They have had me out to present before. I would love to do that again. Just be available to them. So if you're keeping notes, let me know. Also, it's a good point to say thank you to Mount Olive for continuing to host these wonderful opportunities. Any other questions, comments, concerns, considerations, ideas, you can drop them in the chat. You can just speak out loud if you're at church or if you're online with us. Anybody at all?
On the one picture, when Douglas County Historical Society took over Fort Crook House,
Yeah.
there was some kind of a headline about digging for, I don't know. Fort Omaha to dig.
So you can see right here that it says the Historical Society is offering 2 free two-week seminars under the direction of Dr. Joe Sigger from UNO and humanist Roger Reeves in the operation of a historical dig of a late 1800s dump site at Fort Omaha. I don't know what specifically came of that. And it's a rabbit hole that I have not dug down yet. Anyway, archaeological activities like that aren't well documented for the fort itself, but I will do a little bit more digging and see what I can find. For some of you know that I do have an article on NorthOmahaHistory.com where I talk about the history of archaeology in North Omaha. And I mentioned this, but I didn't go into depth on it. So I'll do some more digging and see what I can find. I do know that Roger Reeves was an interesting guy. I did some acting with him in the 1980s when I was a young person at the fort. Also a few other places, and that was cool. But I don't know more about this specific event. Does anybody there know anything? Let me do some more digging. Other questions, comments, concerns, considerations, thoughts, ideas, responses?
Hey, Adam?
Yeah.
When the new reserve took over, Is that when they built that building that's on the north edge of the campus?
Yep, that was built in the 1960s as their facility, and then they slowly spread and took over the whole corner and put in the parking lot and all those different elements.
Only, it's a landmark in my life because that's where I was sworn into the Navy.
Oh.
There we go, living history.
Oh, good grief.
Other people would tell you it's a landmark in their life because it was across the street from R&L's, but that's a different story.
And Mr. C's?
And Mr. C's and Dr. Lofton's old office. What else? Well, folks, this is just about our time. I want to thank you all for coming again. And again, big thanks to Mount Olive for all of your support and kindness. And to all of you, thank you for coming. If you have any ideas for presentations, if you have any ideas for topics I should learn about or study, please feel free to email me, just info@northomahahistory.com. Find me online. I'm on Facebook and Instagram as North Omaha History and LinkedIn, and just trying to get the word out and share all this cool stuff that makes our community such a great place. Thank you all so very much. Yeah.
There's a message on the screen.
Yeah.
Joanne.
What do we got here, Joanne? I am scrolling down. Joanne was on the board of the Douglas County Historical Society at the turn of the century, but haven't had a close relationship with anyone there recently. Ooh, but can give me some info. Fort Omaha was the original campus of Metro. That's true. Carl Tyler, who recently passed away, was involved. That's right. That's absolutely right. So all of the institution that is Metro today began at Fort Omaha in 76. And that's a pretty great story in and of itself. And honestly, a unique history that's really important aside from the fort. So maybe that's going to be a future article idea of mine for me. Thank you so much for that, Joanne. Anybody else?
Metro's currently adding a campus in Sarpy County.
Yeah. And of course, their beautiful expansion in South Omaha decades ago now, and all of the greatness that is where the stockyards were. And yeah, their ongoing work. It's really cool to see what they're doing. All right, folks. Thank you so much. Please have great days. And again, feel free to reach out. info@northomahahistory.com. My name is Adam Fletcher Sasse, and thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
You was sworn on the meeting for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a favor that
Thanks, Joanne. See ya.